Once again, the Lenten passages of Scripture are really long. And you'll look today in your bulletin and you'll see that the Scripture is John 11, 45 verses. I'm not going to do it. Don't worry. Don't worry. We're not going to read all 45 verses. But I'll tell you this. Jesus had some close friends. Now, I'm sure you probably sang it sometime in your growing up years or even recently, what a friend I have in Jesus. So, yes, we are all Jesus's friends. But he had some close friends when he was walking here on earth. In particular, he had friends who were two sisters and a brother who lived in Bethany. Bethany is a town that kind of overlooks Jerusalem. So when you think about it in a way, and it's actually when we go to Palm Sunday next week, it's where the procession will begin in Bethany. And Jesus is starting to look toward his death and what's ahead for him. And as he is away from Bethany, by the way, the sisters were Mary and Martha, and the brother's name was Lazarus. You might remember that Martha liked to make over Jesus. She liked to feed Jesus. She was always worried about his comfort. And Mary liked to sit at the feet of Jesus and just learn from him. So while Jesus is away someplace else, Mary and Martha's brother Lazarus gets really sick. He is really ill. And Mary and Martha call for Jesus to come because they know what he is capable of. They've seen what he is capable of doing, and they felt as though if Jesus would come, that he could heal their brother. Well, Jesus heard that they were calling, but he didn't come right away. In fact, by the time he got there, Lazarus was dead and bound up and buried. Lazarus, as far as Mary and Martha was concerned, was gone. So when Jesus finally arrives at Bethany, they're not real happy with Jesus. And in fact, instead of, calmly praying like we would pray to Jesus, they talk to him more like this. Sometimes when we're going through something difficult, we might have friends tell us, well, you can't talk to Jesus like that. Oh, yes, you can. Oh, yes, you can. You can speak to Jesus in the intensity that you're feeling. And that's what these sisters are doing. They've lost their brother, and they believe in some way Jesus might be part of that. So they're experiencing loss. And as they experience loss, what do we say to some folks when they're experiencing loss? When we're uncomfortable with their loss? You've probably heard it before. Oh, it was his time. God needed another little angel. Yeah, things like that I would like to instruct you as one of the spiritual leaders here. Don't ever say that to anybody. Okay? Just listen. Just listen in a time of loss. Jesus listened. He probably took a little bit of abuse. And then all of a sudden, he says this: I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe that? Do you believe that? I think we hang on to that. And the reply is, yeah, we understand resurrection. We know that there's this time that we're going to come back to life again, and everything will all work out. And, you know, a lot of times when we hear that passage of Scripture, we get caught on the word resurrection. I promise you, if you come back in a couple of weeks, we'll talk about resurrection. It's real. Can't explain it, but it's real. But he also said this. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. And the life. He is not only offering us resurrection for some time out there. He's offering us life for some time out there and for right now, for presently, for at this very moment. He's calling us to life. There was a book written a while back called The Conspiracy of Love. It was written by a man named Kurt Strunkmeyer. In that book, Strunkmeyer talks about the life that Jesus gives us is not wrapped up in our creeds, not wrapped up in our rules, not wrapped up in our regulations. Remember, the world that Mary and Martha and Lazarus lived in, religion was about rules and regulations, whether you did something right or whether you did something wrong. Jesus was now introducing what at the time, and probably at this time still, is controversial, is he's offering love. A life in Jesus Christ is a life offered in love. We are here to live life, and as Jesus says, to live life abundantly. While we're here, this is our opportunity to live life. I read something a while back that I kind of had to chew on for a little bit. The question was asked, if Adam and Eve, remember the creation story, if Adam and Eve had not disobeyed, they would live forever. So we are supposed to live forever. And an answer somebody gave was, if we all lived earthly lives together forever and ever and ever, wouldn't we run out of room? Wouldn't we eventually run out of room? And see, for those who have stepped aside and have gone on to be at home with the Lord, they've given us room to live. To live. There's so many memories we have in this room this morning of people who have gone before us. The legacies they left behind, and they have given us room to leave our legacies, to live our life, to live a life that is grounded in love. In this passage of Scripture this morning, I'm not going to read all 45 verses, but the shortest verse in the Bible is in this passage of Scripture. Anybody want to say it? Jesus wept. 11:35. Jesus wept. He leapt some too, but I got that wrong. He wept. And what we're saying here is in the midst of losing his friend, in the midst of seeing his friends in grief, he wept. He grieved. He showed his sorrow. Once again, if you are grieving today, grieve. If you haven't grieved and you need to grieve, grieve. Don't let anybody ever tell you that in the midst of loss, you can't have your feelings, and you can't express your feelings, and you can't get out your feelings. As the old song went, if it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for us, right? If Jesus wept, it is good enough for us to weep as well in the midst of all our sorrows. Grieve. Grieve. I'm convinced that part of how counselors stay in business, and there's nothing wrong with going to a counselor. That's a way to work through your grief. But sometimes people come to them when they've come through unresolved grief. When someone has convinced them that they just need to stuff it in there and go on with life. Well, of course we want to go on for life, but the best way to do that when we have a loss is to grieve that loss. So Jesus wept. But then he did something no one expected at that point. He walked over to the tomb, and Lazarus had been dead for a few days, and he was all bound up because that's the way they buried people back then. He was wrapped up like a mummy. And Jesus looked into the tomb and said, "Lazarus, come out." And Jesus said that, and Lazarus walked out of the tomb. He came back to life. Now, there is maybe a few of us here this morning saying, wait a minute. If Jesus did that for Lazarus, why didn't he do that for my loved one? Go back to what Mary and Martha had to go through, is sometimes you have to wait. Sometimes you have to wait. With resurrection, sometimes we have to wait. We're waiting. We're waiting. But we know that it's promised. We know that the promise is real. And for us now who use the term that we're living, you ask the question of what needs to die inside of you in order that Jesus might be able to say to you, come out. Come out from whatever it is that keeps you in earthly bondage. In fact, when Lazarus came out, the first thing that Jesus says is unbind him. Get all that stuff off of him that holds him in. And let him be free. Let him to have freedom. And they freed him up. And he was surprised by joy. There is something in most of us, that we can tell Jesus, I need to have this come out. And again, I don't need to have this come out. It's I need to have this come out. And there are things about us that bind us. And we don't say just, geez, could you free me up? No, to say sometimes, I need freedom from this which keeps me in bondage. And Jesus will listen. It'll come in his time. Just wait. Your homework this week is to live life. Accept and embrace this life that God has given us, that our loved ones have given us room to live. And if necessary, and for all of us it's necessary at some time, cry. Cry. Cry out to Jesus. Cry out to him as whatever it is, Jesus, can you have it come out? Unbind my wounds. Make me feel whole and free again. We're going to join together in singing an old hymn called Trust and Obey. And I'm going to invite you to think more about the trust part today. How can you trust Jesus enough to give you life, to give you freedom, to give you joy?